Welcome to the first webinar in the series titled The New Media Between Science and Fiction. Thank you for joining us. My name is Justyna Janiszewska and I'm a director of Fulbright Poland. Pleasure to meet you this way. This webinar and the following ones are organized thanks to the generous support provided by the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs of the US Department of State as part of the Special Congressional Appropriation for Media Literacy, Technology, and Cybersecurity. A year into the pandemic that really glued us to the computers and internet, media literacy is even more viable than ever. Therefore, we are starting the series with recommendation algorithms. But before I go to today's topic, please be reminded that the event is recorded and will be published online for the benefit of those who couldn't be with us today. So if you don't wish to be your face to be recorded and seen in a tiny window by the future viewers, please turn your cameras off. It's an International Data Privacy Day today, after all. Said that, I will leave further housekeeping notices to the moderator of the meeting, and it is my great pleasure to introduce him, Łukasz Król, a coordinator of digital projects at the College of Europe in Natolin campus, an experienced facilitator and trainer in new technologies and digital security. Łukasz, good to have you here. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Amazing.
Łukasz
Thank you so much for the invite.
A discussion with two great experts, Becky Kazansky and Varoon Bashyakarla. I'm leaving the privilege of introducing them in detail to Łukasz. Becky and Varoon, it's an honor to have you here today. Thank you for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, if you like what you take part in today, please follow the webinar's website. It's en.fulbright.edu.pl/webinars or our social media channels and subscribe to the forthcoming events. Let me finish with raising a virtual toast for the 75th anniversary of the Fulbright program that we are celebrating globally this year. Our webinar fits perfectly into the leading theme of January, which is science, technology, and public health. And it is our input into the celebrations of achievements of this unique worldwide program. Cheers, and to you, Łukasz.
Amazing. First of all, thank you so much. The only thing that a slight note of disappointment is that I wish that we had all been briefed on the fact that this is in fact a champagne-filled webinar, because trust me, we would have been even better prepared than we are now. Anyway, it's so wonderful to see both a mix of new faces and familiar faces among the audience. So first of all, thank you so much for all of you for coming over and for filling this room with your energy. And I'm sure some questions, in fact, we've got some questions ahead of time and I'm super excited to ask them. A very brief maybe note about the team. If there was a superhero sci-fi movie about the ascendance of AI and how we needed to fight back the algorithms, I think that Varoon and Becky would pretty much be the superheroes in this film. I mean, both of them are absolutely wonderful. They are scholars, they are activists, and they're people who really know this. And any interest by you would not do them any justice and leave the pleasure to themselves alone. The thing that we'll do is we'll go through this in a very simple way. I will introduce the session a bit, and then we will do a bit of a summary by Varoon of different ad targeting technologies, including some videos. And we'll give a brief introduction to actually algorithms and how they work. Then Becky will give us some fantastic feedback on how we can actually resist surveillance and how people have been resisting surveillance in the past. And afterwards, we will have a lot of time for Q&A. If you have questions that you'd prefer to state anonymously, you can always post the questions in the chat and I will read them out anonymously. So the only thing is, like, we really want this to be a discussion. So if you have a burning issue in your mind that you really want to share, the only rule that I'd say that we have is interrupt early, interrupt often, and interrupt with your deepest questions. But I don't want to take up any more space right now. Varoon, you will be speaking first, so maybe it would be amazing if you could briefly introduce yourself and your work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Łukasz, and the whole Fulbright Poland Commission for having us here today. I'm really happy to be here. I'll just briefly share my screen. I was told to keep things easy and conversational, so this isn't going to be a lecture with lots of PowerPoint slides, but we are in the days of COVID and there are like a million things happening online at any given moment. So I thought it would be helpful to just start with a brief overview of what today will entail. So obviously just opening with some opening remarks. I thought I would just talk a little bit briefly about recommendation algorithms in the real world. I want to keep this really applied, hopefully very relatable. Becky will talk a little bit about historical perspectives around surveillance and how to resist surveillance. And as Łukasz mentioned, we want to keep a lot of time for an open discussion and questions after that. And so hopefully you'll come away today with some basic intuition about what recommendation engines, what recommendation systems are, why they're useful, how they show up in the real world, and also why they should concern us, and what you can do about it to resist, if you so choose, the infrastructures that power a lot of recommendation engines that we encounter in the real world. But with that, I will stop this screen share and just keep it focused on me here. Let me see if I can organize my screens for just a second. Great. So just some basic background about myself briefly. My name is Varoon. I like to think of myself as a public interest technologist. I'm a data scientist by training, and I am based in Berlin. And for the last few years, my work has focused on exploring how our personal data is being used for political purposes. Whether you may realize it or not, actually recommendation engines have quite a lot to do with that phenomenon. And also just to say up front, there will be time for questions at the end, but if there are questions that pop up while I'm speaking, feel free to just toss them in the chat. I'm sure Łukasz or someone else can surface them, and I'd be happy to answer any burning questions as we go when they arise. But just to begin with, I think we all probably intuitively have this basic sense of recommendation to begin with. I mean, what do you think of when you think of recommendations? I think of, for example, books. My colleague might have a book that he or she recommends to me. My parent might have another book, and a friend of mine might have another book based on a shared interest of ours. Although, it's natural to ask, those recommendations, are they based on what I like, or are they based on my parents or my friends or my colleagues' thoughts about what would be interesting to read? So wouldn't it be nice if there were a system or an engine that knew exactly what it is I would like, and what happens in the instance in which I want to read something that's not a book that any of these three people recommended? And that basically is where recommendation engines, recommendation systems come in. Really, at the end of the day, these recommendation engines are just systems that filter content online. That content can take a variety of forms. Products, like what happens with Amazon, that's probably one that we're all familiar with. Movies as well. We've all probably seen movie recommendations on Netflix or on YouTube. I think that's one that we're all very familiar with too. Accounts, for example, if you use Twitter, you are often recommended accounts to follow. Songs, I have to say personally, I am quite a big fan of the Spotify recommendation algorithm. I found a lot of new great music that way. That's other content that's recommended to us. News pieces, a lot of people are consuming news online. It's not uncommon after reading one news piece to see related articles about the same theme that about which you've just read. But recommendation engines and recommendation systems can also appear in other contexts that might seem less intuitive. So people can also be the content that is recommended. If you are on Facebook, you can be recommended potential friends. But also it happens all the time in online dating. you are recommended potential people who could be a match for you. I think this is one area that people may not expect recommendation engines to be playing a role, but they do. And more generally, recommendation engines are a big part of the ad-based infrastructure of the internet. At the end of the day, advertisers are interested in showing you ads for products, recommending things to you that they believe you might have an interest in purchasing or in interacting with and clicking on. These are all recommendations at the end of the day. So for example, if you listen to a jazz song on Spotify, you might be recommended another jazz song or a jazz-esque song based on their knowledge of not just the fact that you listened to that one song, but your entire listening history up until that point. And it's easy to understand why these systems exist. Businesses and publishers are often interested in understanding their customers or users, or publishers are interested in understanding their readers. And it's one system to assume what a reader or a customer or an internet user will be interested in. But readers and users can interact online in unexpected ways, and recommendation engines offer these entities a way to collect more information about these users and to ultimately recommend content to them that might be more relevant. Also, online, we live in this moment of mass information overload, and recommendation engines are a way of helping us narrow down the choices. And those choices, like I said, could be articles to read. They could also be products that are actually being sold, or just content that's being promoted. All of these are ways of helping us kind of deal with the excess of information that we're exposed to online. And it's also great for discovery, not just good for selling things, but like I said, Spotify, Netflix use recommendation at great length to help people discover new content. Ultimately, it's often driven by a business need or imperative to help understand better what users want. I decided I won't go too much into how they actually work. As a data scientist, I'm quite interested in the mechanics of these things. But it seemed like, based on some of the initial information about who will be attending, that the primary focus wasn't so much on the technical systems, although if that is an interest that people have, I'm happy to talk about that maybe during the Q&A, or if you have a question, ping it to, I see Łukasz mentioned in the chat, or to direct message him. But I'm happy to talk about that. But just to sort of provide some basic background on it, let's say I was interested in ordering a hamburger, and I personally don't like mayonnaise on my hamburgers. How would a friend or a system know that? Well, they could ask me first and foremost. They could compare my preferences to people with preferences who are similar to me. So maybe American expats living in Berlin who like to read a lot, just very abstract here, of course. But that's one way of inferring what my hamburger preferences are. And the third way is to, of course, just study my activity. Of course, probably the best way of understanding what it is I want is to look at what I've wanted in the past. And that's what a lot of these systems do. With respect to that first option of simply asking what you want, this is something that almost every major internet platform does. It's called the cold start problem. So if you're new, for example, to an online platform like Twitter or even Facebook, or really anything, you'll often be asked to designate some sort of interest areas, some topics that you're interested in. So these systems can begin to recommend content to you that might have some chance of being relevant to you. Of course, over time, as these systems observe your habits and preferences, the content with which you engage and the content that you ignore, that recommendation system improves over time. And there are ways of inferring what people might be interested in outside of explicitly being explicitly expressing an interest in a topic. You know, I don't necessarily need to say I like tennis and I'm interested in digital rights per se. You know, these are things that general interest areas, politics, travel, that could be inferred from things like my location, my gender, my age. These alone can provide hints as to what it is a recommendation system might be interested in recommending to me. And the business numbers here are quite staggering. Actually, just before the session, I looked it up. 35% of all purchases on Amazon are believed to happen because of Amazon's recommendation system. 70% of YouTube watch time is attributable to recommendations that are made on the platform. And 75% of what, people watch on Netflix are is attributable to Netflix recommendation engine. And, you know, it's not just kind of these entertainment services, Spotify, Netflix. Like I said, a lot of people get their news online. The latest statistic I saw was from 2019 in the US. 43% of Americans were getting their news from Facebook. And you can imagine that statistic is higher in countries in which Facebook is the internet, where there is no alternative. And of course, I think these recommendation systems can be mutually beneficial. I love the new music that Spotify recommends to me. And of course, you know, the more time I spend on Spotify, the more money Spotify can make serving me ads, for example. So they can be mutually beneficial, though they're often driven by a business imperative at the end of the day, profit, making money. And fundamentally, that's informed by an understanding of, or an attempt to understand rather, the underlying user. So I think this, you know, at the end of the day, internet companies and platforms are able to recommend content to you that improves the more they know about you. And I think this gets us into an area that quickly helps us see how systems that are driven by recommendation can be problematic. So I thought I'd just share one story. And it was a piece that researchers worked on a couple of years ago that was published in the New York Times. And I'd be happy to share the link around afterwards if people are interested. But it was about a story of a woman, I believe she was in Brazil, and her 10-year-old daughter had posted a video of herself playing in their backyard pool. She posted this video on YouTube. And before long, this video had accumulated 400,000 views of something that seems very mundane. But it turns out that the researchers discovered that YouTube's recommendation engine was including this video, was recommending this video to people who had been interacting with videos of young, prepubescent, partially clothed children. And this video was in that sequence of recommendations. And slowly over time, these recommendations got slightly more and more extreme. Obviously, this is problematic. This also happens in the context of political radicalization, the ways in which algorithms radicalize people online by feeding them slowly more and more extremist content. You can imagine how this happens with conspiracy theories as well. If some people express some sort of proclivity or interest in a conspiracy theory, they may be fed more and more conspiracy-related content. Perhaps very quickly, they might end up actually believing conspiracy theories. And so, you know, I just saw in the chat that there, you know, these quickly lead us to asking questions about how can we avoid being manipulated? How can we contain the set of information about ourselves that's being exposed online? And the reason why I think it's important to make the connection that recommendation engines aren't just in existence to recommend us new songs and movies and videos to watch on YouTube, but they are in fact part of the underlying internet infrastructure, which is advertising. And I thought instead of just talking about recommendation engines in the abstract and these sort of technological systems that have a business interest in collecting as much information about us as possible, I thought I would share with you a video from MasterCard, from the company MasterCard, talking about a new technology of theirs called NewDetect. And although this itself is not a recommendation that's being made to an end user explicitly, it relies upon the same infrastructure that recommendation systems rely on, and much of the infrastructure powering other technical systems that we live with. And I think it does a nice job of explaining the sheer extent and volume of information that's used that powers much of the technical infrastructure that all of us interact with online every day. So let me pull that video up now. I'm just going to share my screen here.
Perfect. And maybe after the video, we could jump to a couple of questions as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Amazing. Amazing.
Okay. All right. I'm going to just preview this video briefly and hope that it plays. But if not, let me know, because there's audio on the video. So I'm hoping that comes through. Let's give this a shot.
In a world where billions of accounts are compromised, trust has never been more...
Sorry, Varoon, the audio is audible, but not very well. Can you turn on subtitles, maybe?
You know, let me do that. Let me see here.
If you've got the...
I have a local video, a copy of this video, but it's also it's in the public domain. So you can see here my YouTube recommendations, you know, for all of you to see. Obviously, YouTube is very strategic about what it's showing on that screen. Here is the video. Let me see if I can put on subtitles here. Subtitles. Okay, they're in English. Let's give this a shot. And Łukasz, let me know if the audio is not coming through well or if the subtitles are difficult to see.
Will do, of course. Thanks a lot.
In a world where billions of accounts are compromised, trust has
That's
never
much better.
been more important. But how do you bring trust to the digital world? That's where NewDetect comes in. Trust is all about how well you know someone. Like Lisa. When Lisa goes to her coffee shop, her barista recognizes her familiar face, her name, her behavior, and has her usual order ready, a triple latte extra whip. If Lisa wears different clothes one day, her barista still trusts that Lisa is still Lisa, and she still gets the same great customer experience. NewDetect knows Lisa sort of like her barista does. It recognizes her patterns and builds a profile of Lisa that can't be imitated, even if her patterns change. Here's how. NewDetect uses 4 integrated layers to verify her identity profile. The first looks at Lisa's device, connection, and location. It knows that even if the connection comes from Taiwan, it's actually Lisa using her usual iPhone 8 and not an imposter. The second layer looks at behavioral analytics. It knows that Lisa is a loyal Mac user and always uses the latest version of Firefox. The third is passive biometrics. It knows hundreds of things, like how fast Lisa types, her typing cadence, and even the angle she holds her device. And the fourth layer is NewData's Trust Consortium. This brings together billions of anonymously stored data points across NewData's client base and knows if Lisa is behaving like she normally does, or like a good user would. All of these layers are integrated and know Lisa's profile with near 100% accuracy. You get the peace of mind that your business is protected from fraud. And best of all, Lisa enjoys the customer experience she deserves.
All right. Let me stop my screen share here. Hopefully that was that came through all right, hopefully?
Yeah, it was perfect. Thank you.
Okay, good. Yeah, sure thing. There are a couple of things that I find interesting about that video. I think for me, one of the scariest or most compelling parts of it is when they talk about the passive biometrics. I think these are aspects of data that's collected about us that we don't realize. And often it's data from unseeable sources that can end up informing the kinds of recommendations that we see. In this case, of course, they're collecting things like how fast Lisa types on her phone and the angle at which she holds her device to verify whether or not the person in question is in fact Lisa. And one of the other reasons why I was interested in showing this example is that it's ultimately about efficiency at the end of the day. It's about a sort of lack of inconvenience. And I think we should be conscious that whether we're talking about our media consumption or what products we buy online, the people we choose to date or not date based on the recommendations to us, there's information about us that very well may be used in ways that we don't expect. And I thought that would be a nice, when Becky, Łukasz, and I talked about this panel, we thought it would be important to talk about that infrastructure that powers a lot of this recommendation systems that we encounter online. And I think I will, in a second, momentarily hand it off to Becky to talk about how, actually, while some aspects of these technologies are new and recent, of course, the practice of surveilling people and attempting to influence their behavior is, of course, not new. But first, suppose let's take some questions, yeah?
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to very, very quickly start one question that I think sums up quite a lot of those, which is, with so much data actually being generated. So like if you, for example, look at something like Facebook or Twitter, right? We've got hundreds of friends on Facebook generating hundreds of updates at the same time. So without recommendation algorithms, like the modern internet wouldn't work, right? Like if, for example, your uncle were to post 50 photos from his front porch, then like the recommendation algorithm needs to tell people that there are more important and interesting things there. So do you think that like with the amount of data that we generate and with the amount of data that we share, with the amount of Netflix shows that are being created, do you think that it's impossible to have an algorithm, an internet without recommendation algorithms? Or do you think that it's actually the other way around? Do you think that recommendation algorithms have actually created the internet, the information saturated internet that we have right now?
I think that recommendation algorithms have been it's a little bit of a chicken or the egg problem, but I think at its core, these recommendation systems have been a response to the sheer volume of information that we have access to online. I think much of the internet infrastructure, even some of the big platform companies like Facebook and Google, they are also a response to the fact that today we have access to so much information. And we need a means by which to navigate it. And I think if people don't realize, if all of us go to Google and search something, we will all likely see different things based on where we are, what our primary language of preference is, what Google knows about us. Mark Zuckerberg had a quote famously saying something like, a squirrel dying in someone's front yard might be more important than a child dying in Africa, something like that. That was the effect of the quote. And the point was, like, who are we to designate whether one of those stories is more important to show to a viewer than the other? And I think that's part of what makes some of the moral dilemmas with recommendation systems so tricky, because these internet platforms to their defense, they are listening to user preferences. They are responding to what it is people are interested in. And it makes sense in many ways in an online world in which there's so much information to show that content that is most relevant to the user based on what that user, based on the information that user has chosen to share with you, consciously or not. However, at the end of the day, that decision is still being driven by a business interest, in this case, to keep people's eyes online for as long as possible, to maximize the number of clicks on ads. So it's this kind of interplay between not only listening to the user and providing the user content that the user has expressed an interest in, but doing so while subject to the company's underlying business interests. And I think that's where a lot of these questions arise. Where does the recommendation engine become too extreme? The reason why I say it's a little bit of a chicken or the egg problem is because I think, recommendation engines, I believe, were created to help us navigate the sheer information overload that we have to deal with. However, I don't necessarily think that they've simplified the problem much either. I think we're still in a state of sheer information overload, even though we have the benefit and the problems that recommendation engines have created and maintained.
But I absolutely love this framing that you put forward, that like recommendation engines are both something that people want and that they are something that's also being exploited by commercial interests. Like, I find this framing to be super, super useful. So thanks so much for putting it forward. I'm very, very aware of the time, and I want to make sure that there's as much time as possible for discussion at the end. And I've seen that there are a couple of questions. There was one about how we can prevent being manipulated and how we can escape the recommendation bubble. I would just recommend that we save those actually for the second part, because Becky, I know that you'll be talking a lot about resistance. So it's not that I'm avoiding your questions. I'm just like very, very aware that some of those will be tackled during the second half. But actually, Varoon, one of the things that I also saw highlighted in the questions a bit has been actually stuff about the legal environment, right? So has there been like any real strong attempts at legislating recommendation algorithms? And if they haven't, or if the current legislative framework isn't strong enough, what did your, I guess, dream legislation with regards to recommendation algorithms look like? If you could be sitting in the White House or in the European Commission tomorrow and be given the portfolio of figuring out recommendation algorithm regulation, what would you do?
Yeah, totally. So the short answer is no, there has not really been specific legislation on trying to fix recommendation algorithms. And that's not exactly a bad thing. The reason for that is that the problems that we see when we think about the negative effects of recommendation engines are not actually specific to recommendation engines. They are due to many of the same underlying problems that manifest themselves in different ways across the internet. So even though there's nothing specifically trying to fix recommendation engines themselves, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because at the end of the day, these problems will be fixed by more broad sweeping attempts to fix a whole collection of digital issues to begin with. So it's a little bit of, there's a deeper rooted problem that that needs to be solved. And I think that's the problem that is being solved. If I were the person making this, designing the future of the internet in this way, I think the one factor that's really important to me is that people truly know and have control over what exact information they choose to share with a recommendation system. I don't want to navigate an online space without the power of recommendation engines. It would be overwhelming. It is overwhelming already. It would be even more overwhelming for me, I think. And I think, being served relevant content is not a bad thing. However, I want the power and I want the ability to say, yes, you can recommend me content based on my age and location or country of residence, but not, however, based on my race or sexual orientation, just for example, or, or even other things that are less identity specific. I don't want to be recommended content based on my location history, or I don't want to be recommended content based on my political leanings. That's a little bit easier said than done, but I think that is one of the core central issues in creating online spaces that we feel comfortable being in, truly being in a position of power to say and to dictate what information about ourselves we're happy to have used and what information about ourselves we feel less comfortable being commodified.
So Varoon, I would push back on this a bit, and then let's give Becky the floor. But one very quick question is, for me, the central flaw with this is that even if we ask algorithms not to use certain types of data, they will still sort of root around it, right? So let's, for example, say that algorithms could be using our location. Like, we tell algorithms that it's okay to, for example, target data to our location, but it's not okay to target data to our level of wealth, right? Well, there is such a huge correlation between location and level of wealth that essentially you can already guess everything about your level of wealth due to pretty much your location and, let's say, whether or not you own a car, right? So there's so many ways to actually root around those sensitive issues, and there's so much stuff that can be figured out about you. Like, there was even a map, there was even Timnit Gebru, the ex-Google data scientist, I believe it was Hirsch who presented the research that you can figure out political leanings just by looking at which town someone lives and whether or not they own a truck, right? So I'm just really curious as to how would you actually make this work to allow people to pick what data is not used within the decision process and make sure that this data isn't subtly correlated by algorithms in other ways, for example, by looking at where location and wealth levels overlap.
You're totally right. And it's exactly why I sort of said it's easier said than done, because there are so many ways of circumventing these restrictions. And more generally, I think one of the big challenges we have with specifically with legal interventions, legal restrictions imposed on internet technologies, is that even when restrictions are in place or when they're discussed, when there's a possibility of them being enacted, there's so many ways in which there are technological workarounds. And this is exactly one of them, that you might restrict the collection of certain kinds of information, but you can still end up finding proxies or other features that are highly correlated with the feature that you want to protect. And this is a problem. And I think this, to me, it's, for me, not a very satisfying answer, what I'm about to say, but I think, this is why, these infrastructures, these systems are incredibly complex. And I think explainability is also really important. And if we say that I don't want information about my income or my location to be used, I think it's also incumbent upon us, or the companies employing these technologies, building these technologies, to ensure that the algorithms that they use are ones that respect those preferences. So, maybe a neural network, a kind of really sophisticated algorithm that can re-engineer these protected traits, location and income level, might be something that we can't use because of the way it works because it produces results that are very difficult to interpret. We don't have an easy way of saying, we put in A, B, and C and got out X, Y, and Z. I think that the explainability component, that translation, is really important. And unless we can do that reliably, I think we run the risk of using algorithms that undermine, circumvent, or at worst, like totally ignore the good faith rules that we're trying to put in place. And yeah.
Okay, that's amazing. If a terrifyingly bleak conclusion, but worry not, I will do my very, very best to steer this conversation towards a slightly more optimistic note. And in fact, what can be more optimistic than the politics of resistance? So Becky, I would love to invite you to take the floor. I know that you've been working a lot on resistance to surveillance, both as it's happening now and as it's happening in the past. But I do need to start with a very, very pertinent question to start. Can you tell us the backstory behind your background, and is it related to resistance to surveillance?
Oh, okay. My background. How far back and how personal are you asking here?
I'm just curious because this is fine background, right?
Yeah. So I guess I'll just start with an intro about myself, and hopefully I'll provide you the answer you're looking for. My name is Becky. I am currently a researcher at the University of Amsterdam. So I'm based in Amsterdam. Used to also be based in Berlin, so was a little bit further east. At the moment, I'm I'm a PhD candidate. I'm about to finish my thesis. Like a couple of weeks from now, I'll be submitting the manuscript, and I'm working with a project called Data Active, which is about the politics of data according to civil society. And it investigates both how civil society uses data for initiatives around social good, so to speak, and also how it resists encroachment from governments and corporations together. And my background is that before I came to the university, I worked as a digital security trainer and an educator on privacy issues. And so that's something I've done for about 10 years now. And I also have like a longer history going back. I think it started more with human rights and kind of personal causes around human rights, which gradually kind of brought me deeper into technology issues, I would say. I'll also just start by introducing someone who's with me today. This is Chavez. He's kind of hard to see against the background because he's a black void panther, as we call him. But so he's disappearing into the flames. There he is. So he'll be assisting me with this presentation. As any presentation about the internet should be, assisted by cats. I just wanted to mention one thing about the question of like, is there any legislation pending? I just want to quickly mention that there is something actually at the moment called the Digital Services Act package. It's currently a proposal to EU Parliament. It's probably going to take a while to get it through, but it has been positioned as a modernization of the e-commerce directive, which is from 2000. And it does aim to actually address transparency issues around algorithms and about the fact that some people see some things and other people see others. And so I think this is going to be kind of a long process to get this integrated within broader EU institutions around data protection and the like. But it is encouraging that it already exists as this proposal. So I'm just gonna now backpedal to kind of a broader introduction of what we mean by resistance. So in terms of my research and how this has brought me to this discussion, I guess, in my research work, I study how predictive technologies and predictive logics affect our lives. And more specifically, how communities that are marginalized through different forms of discrimination fight back against the harms of data-driven systems. And that includes things like predictive policing systems, kind of more old school telecommunications surveillance, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot more there. But I think in terms of this, I think the idea and concepts around prediction are pretty central to what we worry about when we talk about algorithms and recommender systems. Perhaps some of you have heard of recently a book that was published by the scholar Shoshana Zuboff with her book, Surveillance Capitalism. And I do like one way that she frames the issues around prediction, which is that with these kinds of algorithmic systems that we talk about, the companies and the systems that they create are taking data about ourselves, our lives, our bodies, our identities, and packaging them into products that are sold on what she calls people futures markets. So that sounds pretty creepy, actually, but the idea is that the idea to be, or the ability to be able to predict, or the attempt to try to predict, because actually prediction is quite hard, that and then is key to then also being able to manipulate behaviors in some way, whether that means to buy more of a certain thing or read more of a certain kind of content. And so, yeah, the question is then, well, what happens if these, we're in this environment where we feel that these different entities around us are constantly trying to predict what we'll do next, and to also use that to exploit our behavior. And so in my research, what I look at is how when you're in this kind of environment, it forces people to then also try to anticipate and be very concerned with futures or data futures, to try to anticipate how their behaviors might be tracked and used against them, which of course is difficult because so much about how these systems work is kept purposefully opaque. And it creates a bit of a snake eat tail situation, actually, where companies on the one hand will try to predict what we will do, and then we in turn have to predict what they are going to predict about us. So that seems a little bit like a lose-lose proposition. It creates a particular kind of societal dynamic where like, how do you create solidarity and collective action when you're constantly kept focused on trying to predict a particular kind of undesirable future? So that's kind of the more philosophical questions that I tackle in my research. Talking about resistance more broadly in relation to surveillance, I always like to say that where there is surveillance or intrusion into our personal lives through different kinds of technology, there is always going to be some sort of resistance, even if we don't consider it or call it resistance as such. Different kinds of pushback, different kinds of workarounds. It's simply a part of how we humans do things, is that we're always pushing back in different ways against the borders around us, basically. And in thinking about algorithms and resistance, when people are objecting to algorithms, I think it's important to note that they are objecting to more than the algorithm itself, because the algorithm is part of a larger system. And so what they're really objecting to probably is various kinds of bureaucratic processes, institutional inertia, for example, racism that gets baked into the kinds of algorithms that we are concerned with, and more broadly, how information is sorted and categorized about us. And another thing is, when you hear the word resistance, you might think perhaps of some sort of grassroots initiative or a particular kind of activism. But resistance is actually quite multifaceted. So I consider regulatory measures to be a form of resistance, literacy initiatives, accountability campaigns, and also individual user practices. And as others have already mentioned, both surveillance and automated decision-making systems and even algorithms are not just a novel phenomena, but have been part of our society for a very long time. However, because technological systems change so quickly these days, it is continuously requiring different kinds of social groups to come up with new kinds of resistance. So I don't know if there are already any questions. Otherwise, I want to introduce like 3 very brief cases of groups trying to resist algorithms.
I'll just quickly check the chat. I don't think that there are any no, there aren't. The only comments are comments praising Chavez.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think a lot of questions also about legal regulation. So resistance falls really, really well into that.
Yeah.
Please tell us the 3 case studies.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to outline 3 areas of resistance. There's many more, and there's different ways, of course, of thinking of them. For today, the first category is efforts towards algorithmic transparency, accountability, and explainability, as Varoon mentioned, through projects that track and try to expose algorithms for what they really are. The second area is efforts to establish ethics guidelines within companies and institutions that use algorithms. And the third is, rather than ethics guidelines, something bolder and bigger, which is establishing red lines at an institutional or EU level, for example, for what we consider an acceptable use of algorithms in relation to human rights. And yeah. And so for the first case about transparency, accountability, and explainability, I decided why not introduce something very close to home. So the project I work on, Data Active at the University of Amsterdam, has had a spin-off emerge over the last couple of years, initiated by Claudio Agosti and led with Stefania Milan and several other team members. And the aim of this project is to reclaim our own algorithmic sovereignty. And it's called Algorithms Exposed, or ALEX for short. And what the ALEX project has done is to create several tools that are capable of exposing algorithmic curation as it happens on different commercial platforms. And their aim has been to enable, rather than always data scientists or other kinds of specialists and experts, they want ordinary users to be a part of this process of algorithm auditing, as it's termed. And not only is this desirable, it's actually necessary, because it turns out that one of the only ways that you can uncover algorithmic curation is by actually tracking over time how an individual user sees things, like what do they see, what don't they see, and then comparing that against the experiences of others. So it's actually quite a complex process, and what this tool does is that it allows a user to collect evidence around what they see and what they don't see. And then from comparing that with others, you're able to get some sort of bigger picture. This project has had to work around a lot of constraints. For example, commercial platforms are constantly shutting down their APIs, or in other words, the databases that would allow researchers to really get a good look inside. It's a bit of a cat and mouse game. There was some encouraging news about Twitter the other day. So perhaps this will allow, for example, researchers using Twitter to be able to get a better look. But in any case, it's a challenge for anyone who wants to engage in algorithmic auditing. But what they have managed to accomplish in the last couple of years is to do several studies, for example, around EU elections in Italy. They looked at and were able to actually really record the differences in content that people saw. And they are able to say that this is quite a common phenomena, that so it's not just a myth that that we have different personalized experiences. There's evidence for it. And from this experience, and here I'm going to draw on some of the findings from a report called The Invisible Curation of Content by the Web Foundation from 2018. And they made several recommendations for what really needs to be changed in light of what we know about recommender systems. So I'll just mention a couple. And one was, why not have this idea of a real-time transparency dashboard, which would allow users to compare what they see against others. So this could be something potentially that would be created. It's hard to see what the incentive would be for a company to do this unless it were actually built into regulation around targeted advertising. A second proposal I think is quite simple, but really central. I don't know what Varoon would think of it though, because it goes against the idea that we always need recommender systems. They basically want to go back to chronological ordering of news feeds and posts. So they want that to be the default mode rather than the highly personalized news feed that we see now. So maybe that's something to debate. And of course, because of all the challenges of researching these systems, they really want to find ways to facilitate independent research. And so, as I mentioned, it could include trying to force companies to open up their APIs so that you can see the data better, et cetera. And aside from Alex, there are a number of related projects. For example, the investigative journalism outfit in the US, ProPublica, they've done a series of investigations about algorithms. And the Markup is another investigative journalism outfit, which has released something called the Citizen Browser, which seems actually in some respects quite compatible with what Alex has been doing. Also at NYU, there's something called the Ad Observatory. So there are these like different constellations, and I've only mentioned a few. There's many more, and there's constantly new creative projects arising around this. Yeah, and now I guess I can come to the second area that I wanted to explore, which is this attempt to establish ethics guidelines for how algorithms are constructed and used on us. And in the last couple of years, there's been quite a lot of news about attempts to create oversight boards, both within companies and in governmental bodies. Specific to the EU, for example, you have the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence, which from 2019 onwards has worked to come up with an EU approach to algorithms and this idea of algorithmic sovereignty. And they have produced an output called the Ethics Guidelines for Trustworthy AI. Now, when they did produce this list of ethics guidelines, they faced a lot of criticism from civil society on a wider level. And that's because in this kind of project of ethics, you don't necessarily ever have to draw a red line over what would be acceptable or not. Sorry, Chavez is causing some chaos. 1 second. Yeah, he has a lot of opinions about this. So civil society groups in the EU have really pushed for the idea that we have to have red lines instead, which really give us a clearer picture of what is morally acceptable to us. And I'll get back to that in the third area or case that I'm presenting. I think also as my other two panelists have mentioned, the ex-Google data scientist Timnit Gebru, I think the case of her firing, which I don't know how many people are familiar with, but it goes like this. She recently published with a number of others a really expansive and important report about large-scale language models used at Google, as well as its environmental impacts and issues with bias, specifically racism. And so she was fired for that, as well as for the diversity work that she'd been doing for the company. And some people have argued that this exposes the limitations of ethics discourse, because here you have one of these main drivers of AI and algorithmic ethics, and they're supposed to be guiding a company forward, one of the most important companies working in this area. But as soon as they release something that doesn't square perfectly with the business bottom line, they get ousted. So that's a problem. And it seems to expose the limits of ethics in this area. On the other hand, it also shows the power, because when this happened, it created a huge amount of public controversy. And the paper that she produced with others has now received, well, I don't know how much, but so much more attention potentially than it might have otherwise, because academic articles have a way of getting swallowed and not necessarily ever seeing that many eyes. But in this case, it basically guaranteed that many, many people would read this. So it's up for it's up for debate. To what degree can we rely on ethics frameworks and ethics oversight boards in our attempt to create more just data-driven systems? And finally, I'm going to talk about this effort to establish red lines and what we consider morally acceptable. So of course, the topic of our webinar today is recommender systems. So this might fall a little bit outside. I just want to mention a quick project about predictive policing, which I guess you can sort of think of as a recommender system, because it's recommending criminals and locations associated with potential criminality to cops. So it's like a recommender system for cops. I guess that's one way to think of it. And these kinds of systems have been in place for over a decade now. And along the way, there has been a lot of civil society pushback against the harms that they have caused, particularly in the US for poor, Black, unhoused communities in cities like Los Angeles and, sorry, let me just turn this off, Los Angeles and New Orleans. And we have plenty of these also in use in Europe. In this case of predictive policing, I think is important because it, again, gets us to the limit of the algorithmic bias discussion. One group that has been especially active in pushing back against these systems is Stop LAPD Spying. It's a grassroots and volunteer-driven group based in Los Angeles. And what they have really noted in the last years is when we talk about bias in systems and in algorithms, you have a lot of efforts that now try to isolate that bias and through scientific means remove whatever this element of bias is from the algorithmic system. So this is a broad area of work in data science at the moment. And especially the fairness, accountability, transparency community is active in trying to technically remove bias from systems. Now, what the grassroots organizers with Stop LAPD Spying underline is that the bias in a system is never just bias in the system or in the algorithm. It's reflecting the bias of the people who have created it, who are using it, who have commercial and governmental interest in it. So it's not enough to then simply try to regulate the algorithm or to remove the bias from the algorithm or to somehow reform the algorithm. They push for the dismantlement of the broader systems that house these algorithms and the data that the algorithms are implicated in collecting. And what that has resulted in is a real focus on abolitionism. In other words, it's necessary to actually abolish and ban particular kinds of technological systems because we have drawn a red line and decided that the harm that they have caused is simply unacceptable on grounds of human rights and social justice. And now that I've given a US-centered example, of course, I also want to provide one from the EU as a counterpoint. There's a really exciting new campaign, actually, that kicked off a few days ago. It's called the Reclaim Your Face campaign. And it's an initiative organized by a coalition of European civil society organizations who are pushing on a ban on the use of facial recognition and mass biometrics more broadly. So this connects to the video that Varoon showed us with the biometric data collection. And this push to simply ban these technologies comes after a couple years now of controversy over whether you can actually assign a red line to acceptable use. And on the one hand, you have groups who believe that you can simply reform this. You don't have to stop whatever or ban whatever technology is in question. And they argue that this would also be detrimental to European innovation, especially at a time where other parts of the world are really forging ahead with innovation around data, algorithms, and AI. So it's framed as an issue of, if we don't continue with these systems, we're going to fall behind. And on the other hand, you say, or the groups who are involved in this campaign now say, you know, you can argue that this could slow innovation, but you could also say that this is a unique form of responsible innovation, to also be able to say when to simply not create a system, when to simply stop doing things that we know are harmful, when you simply have to dismantle something. So in the case of the Reclaim Your Face campaign, they are really pushing for a broad ban on facial recognition technology. For them, it's not enough to simply have an oversight board or an ethics committee. I'm going to leave it there. I hope I've provided you with a wide scope of different kinds of projects. Yeah.
That's fantastic. And I really loved the focus on the last bit. So actually on the elimination, super interesting. Thank you so much. Just one thing that I kind of wanted to touch upon, because Varoon kind of spoke about the commercial angle, and you also spoke about, for example, algorithms being used in state surveillance and policing. And to what extent do you think is there a link like this? Is there a revolving door that if, for example, Facebook creates a recommendation algorithm to deliver ads to you, then this technology will then, for example, be used by police forces or vice versa? Is there sort of a bridge being built between the private surveillance sector and a public surveillance sector, or does that not exist that much?
No, you pointed out a crucial issue, which is that the bridge was built a very long time ago. In fact, for as long as you look, the bridge has been there. This isn't even that long ago. This is relatively recent history. But if you look at, for example, what happened in the wake of the September 11 campaigns, sorry, brain freeze for 1 second. In the wake of September 11 attacks in the US in 2001, counterterrorism in the US got a huge push for very obvious reasons. And this involved the use of a lot of new kinds of data-driven technologies to try to predict terrorist threats. And this really relied upon mass surveillance of the US population and also populations around the world. And something that maybe not everyone is aware of is that the real, the heart of this system and the algorithms that were used to be able to kind of scrape and identify suspicious anomalies within the data collected through mass surveillance, those actually came from the marketing industry. You had analysts who had come from marketing and basically came in and sold a particular kind of service to the government at a time where national safety was a priority. And this was then implemented within systems that we think of as an issue of government surveillance. So my point is that it's not even a bridge, it's a complex relationship, and the two have always been interwoven. In the years since then, Facebook data and other kinds of data online have regularly been sold to different kinds of governmental agencies, also provided upon request, of course. So yeah, it's more than just a bridge, yeah.
That's super interesting. And I think that this segues beautifully into one question the participant asked in the chat, which can be addressed either to you or to Chavez, of course, but has our sort of law enforcement and counterterrorism become more effective for those prediction algorithms or not? Have they actually changed the way law enforcement is being conducted, or has it mostly been a shiny tool for law enforcement that hasn't led to vastly different results?
Well, I think that whichever institution you ask will probably have a different answer about this, because it's
that's why we're asking you.
Yeah, I think the question of whether it's effective is a separate question from whether it has changed policing, because it has absolutely changed law enforcement and also other kinds of government processes that rely upon data collection and surveillance. The rise of predictive policing would be one example of that. And what's really interesting there is that it also offers us a case of surveillance resistance that isn't always framed as resistance. And I think it gets to the answer to this question. So if you look at the systems implemented in New Orleans and LA, over the years, there has been just as much dissatisfaction with them among the police forces themselves as there is from the groups working on behalf of the populations and communities that have been affected by over-policing and other kinds of harm. And one of the big concerns has been that these systems have run upon commercial platforms by companies who have come in and offered services which would make data analytics easy and accessible to people where once it was really only the domain of the specialists of the highest order. And the thing is that would then create a dependency between this commercial vendor providing data analytics and the police force. Now, over time, some of these police forces saw that they weren't actually it wasn't actually as useful as they had anticipated. It was mostly leading to over-policing of places where they already knew there was a problem, and not necessarily providing them with clues otherwise that would help them with their work. And this led them to decide that they wanted to actually step away from these commercial systems that they were using and try to create something of their own, perhaps, that would achieve their goals better. When they tried to do that, the commercial vendor said that they could not, that they were basically locked in, and if they left, they would no longer have access to any of the data products that they had relied upon. So this has really kind of created a pivot in how police forces now think about their data, and there is the question of then what is the next generation of policing, because I don't think it is so simple that they will now step away from the use of data completely, but the way that they do it and the systems they rely on will probably change.
Okay, thanks so much for this answer. And there's one more question. But one of the things that I kind of wanted to flag up is this amazing essay kind of about data and governance by this badass internet scholar called Zeynep Tufekci. I totally recommend checking out her work if you haven't already. And she actually wrote something kind of similar about the Chinese government's response to COVID, but essentially that the Chinese government was collecting data on so and so many levels, but was completely confident of the data it collected, but the data contained a lot of blind spots. So essentially, because they asked everyone to report economic data, good news, CCTV footage, the Chinese government was sure that they knew everything about the country. So that when the sort of local governors were hiding data about COVID, the Chinese government had confidence that was seeing a lot of data, but it had no sort of epistemic modesty about the data that was not actually being captured. So I think that this kind of plays into it as well. But another fantastic question, and I think it's both to Varoon and to Becky and to Chavez, and maybe even to me, is what is the idea, what is our idea about algorithmic literacy? How can we best educate people? Varoon, Becky, who wants to take this?
I'll give this to Varoon to start.
I was gonna hand it off to Łukasz to hear your thoughts. But I guess while I'm speaking, I'll just speak briefly. I think it's a really good question. I think that kind of digital literacy is one piece of the puzzle. I think, when I think more broadly about how we're going to fix all of these problems, I think, there are legal interventions that need to happen. And, Becky mentioned was it the European Democracy Action Plan or the other one? Anyway, Becky just mentioned one of them. For example, that's one ongoing one in Europe. I think legal interventions of all sorts will be needed. I think there needs to be product and design changes from private companies themselves. I think as they are realizing firsthand the consequences of the current status quo. And the third element, of course, is digital literacy. I think it's extremely important. I think there are a lot of ways to do so. As a technologist, one of the things that I have challenged myself to do is to try to show how these technologies work instead of just talking about how they work. I think it's different, I think, for an everyday observer to, for example, like see this new detect video from Microsoft talk specifically about how they promote the work they're doing, than to just know that it's happening in this way. I think that's, I think showing is an important part of that kind of digital literacy. I think also a really important piece of that has to be not being prescriptive about what the solution is, because at the end of the day, we are all making decisions in our digital lives with a different set of values. You know, we can't be telling people stop using Facebook, don't use WhatsApp. You know, maybe a small local business relies heavily on Facebook for its survival. You know, maybe one person's adversary is a private company or the state. Maybe for someone else, it's an abusive partner, for example. I think all of the solutions on the table, I think all the solutions, all the options should be on the table, and that the digital literacy programs that we support should not be prescriptive in this way.
Perfect. No, that's a fantastic point. If I can actually add one more thing on top of this, I think that we've long had this perception that like technology is magic, right? And in many ways, technology very much feels like magic. And like even now, right? Like I am literally speaking to a piece of glass in silicon. And for some weird reason, this then goes to fiber optic cables, which is somehow being encoded into zeros and ones. And then it gets to all of you all around the world in, I can probably check even, but in less than 50 milliseconds, okay? Like this is pretty much magic. But the issue with magic is that magic is a term which prevents us from questioning a lot of things, okay? So just because something feels like if something feels like magic, we are much, much less likely to actually inquire who built this, what are the economic incentives behind it, whose interests does it represent, and the like. So I think that one of the main things that we can probably say about algorithmic literacy is that we cannot treat algorithms as magical as algorithms are. We cannot treat them as magic. And I think that sometimes this almost like is mythology of the algorithm emerging, right? One of my favorite tweets about this topic is when someone who is driving for Lyft, which is a competitor to Uber in the United States, told a passenger that today has been a very good day. I've been blessed by the algorithm. Mm-hmm. And it was incredible how sort of the drivers for whom the algorithms were determining how much money they would make, the algorithms, the recommendation algorithms and everything, all of this was essentially, there was almost like a semi-divine mythology to it, okay? And I am kind of like a political scientist, kind of historian by education, and I sometimes write about the mythology of technology as well. But for me, demythologizing algorithms is one of the most powerful things that can happen, okay? And say that even if we don't understand how they work, even if it makes no sense whatsoever that I'm shouting at a piece of silicon and it gets into your headphones within 50 milliseconds of me shouting it, this still means that this is a human system. It's been designed by humans with human economic incentives, with human business incentives. Those humans are flawed, and those humans are building it all on flawed human data. So I think that for me, the main piece of sort of media literacy that we could do is to say that you are not being blessed by the algorithm, because the algorithm is something that's being designed by humans. The algorithm isn't divine. The algorithm isn't magic. The algorithm seems like magic, but it's actually just something really, really, really clever. Okay, you also asked us to send the titles and links to all the projects and initiatives. Ooh, that's gonna be fun. Are there any more questions to either Becky or Varoon?
While people are typing, oh, go ahead, sorry.
If I may, I just decided to do it via video because it's fun talking to the screen, right? So the question was about what do we do with the algorithms education? Like, how do we build algorithms literacy? And I'm wondering, is it possible? Like Łukasz told us, right, that it's so complicated that probably we cannot understand it. But is it possible for people like non-technical people to be informed about what kind of data is used for what? I mean, imagining in the ideal world that the platforms would like to give us the information, like, is it possible for us to actually understand it? Because, today we have the data privacy day, and we do have regulations on data privacy, but many people tend to ignore, all those notifications that we have, all those information clauses about whether it would be cookie files or whether it is, that you're giving your consent to for your data to be, accumulated somewhere and analyzed in a way. So the question, in short, is it possible for us to understand, for the information to be provided in a way that is understandable for non-technical people?
Who wants to take this one?
Well, I mean, I will just mention, I think whether it is possible is always a question of how creative and how much energy we put into the the issue, and in creating accessible resources for people, and also making sure that the literacy translates into broader mobilization and accountability initiatives. And in my prior work, I actually worked on several of these literacy projects. One was called myshadow.org, which I believe still lives in some form, but it did actually have a function that would allow you to easily kind of select the kind of device you use and what you do with that device, and then get some sense of the kind of data that would then be exposed through your technological use. And I think there are always more initiatives like this popping up, and I think that the both other panelists here have something to say about that. Yeah.
I completely agree. I mean, I think it's totally possible. It's 100% possible. And I think, to some extent, I think that, some tech organizations would say that they're trying to do that already, on the iPhone, for instance. There are ways of controlling which apps have access to your address book, your social network, which apps have access to your location, things like this. I think that, of course, is, there are a couple of different layers here. First, there's the whole user experience behind making that visible and accessible and more user-friendly and usable at the end of the day. But then there's also the piece of the puzzle that you're probably talking about as well, which is how do we connect the dot from making that functionality available to actually helping people understand what does it mean for a weather app to have access to my location data that might end up in the hands of a political entity, for example. Yeah, I think it's absolutely possible for sure. It's just a matter of resolve and resources, really, but it's absolutely possible.
Yeah, if I can add one thing though, I think that one of the issues that's always difficult in all of this is that sometimes it's hard for us to think like an algorithm, in that human brains and algorithmic brains are sort of wired very, very differently. And one of the best examples of this is the process of explanation for me, okay? So like when humans seek out explanations, we don't actually want to know an explanation. We want something that fits into our complex narrative of life, right? So imagine that you have like a 5-year-old, and the 5-year-old ate all of the cookies before dinner. And you're asking the 5-year-old, why did you eat all of the cookies before dinner? So there's like two explanations. The first explanation is the purely technical explanation, which is that the 5-year-old ate all the cookies before dinner because like 5-year-olds have undeveloped brains and no sense of self-control and are evolutionary primed to seek out cookies everywhere they see, right? And then there's sort of the social explanation, which the 5-year-old could essentially cry and say, I didn't know that there was going to be dinner. If the 5-year-old cried and said I didn't know there was going to be dinner, you'd give the 5-year-old a hug and reassure him. If the 5-year-old told you, my brain has an underdeveloped sense of self-control, you'd be very, very confused. But essentially what this means is that when we seek out explanations, we don't always seek out explanations that are purely technical, right? We seek for an explanation that builds a narrative. When we ask for explanations, we usually ask for something that gathers the facts into a really, really nice story that somehow fits into the rich narrative tapestry of our lives, rather than a purely technical explanation. And if we ask algorithms for why, for example, something was recommended to us, we will get something very dry, like this was recommended to you because this and this variable was set to such and such a number. So I think that this is another big, big issue, that when humans seek out explanations or reasons, we never actually seek out technical explanations. We never seek out the explanation that the 5-year-old ate all the cookies because 5-year-olds are evolutionally primed to seek out sugar. We seek out the explanation that the 5-year-old, we seek out an explanation that the 5-year-old was sad or missing us and was scared that there was not going to be dinner. We are seeking out the explanation that's actually a narrative that fits into our brain storytelling structures. And this, I think, is really, really interesting and kind of still underdeveloped as a problem, that essentially algorithms don't yet fully fit into the way we think of ourselves and think of ourselves in the world. And there's really cool technical attempts to like push back on this and to translate algorithmic explanation to human explanation. But I'm looking at the clock and we've got around 1.5 minutes left. So I'm afraid it's going to be out of the scope. Any final questions? It looks like people have to run. We've got time for one final question. And you can, okay. So with no questions, let's do analytical closing remarks instead. Varoon, you came first in the explanation, so you'll come second in the closing remarks. Becky, is there anything that you want to say as a closing remark at the end?
I just want to thank everyone for this very interactive discussion today. Hopefully, I've managed to show the flip side to the kind of scary dystopian stories we hear all the time about technology, and that there actually are things that we can do at both a personal and collective level in response. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And Varoon?
Thank you so much for having me today. I just read Julia's question in the comments, and I just thought I'd briefly take the opportunity to just respond to it briefly. And I think, Julia, your question gets at a central crux of all of these things, which is like the effectiveness of these technologies. And I think yeah, this claim that these supposedly super sophisticated algorithms are actually not really outperforming, you know, a random guess or a hodgepodge of people just making a prediction of their own, I think gets to one of the underlying questions that I think is important for all of us to think about, which makes what Becky talked about all the more relevant, which is ultimately, what are the intentions of the systems around us, of the infrastructures, you know, regardless of how well they're working or not working, what does the fact that they are trying to use all this information about us say about ultimately the goals they're trying to accomplish? Anyway, I have to say I am quite optimistic. Becky, I found your piece uplifting. I do think that there is a lot that we can do. You know, I do believe we can live in a world in which digital technologies enhance our lived experience, not undermine them. And yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to come chat with all of you today.
Amazing. I just want to finish on a similar note. I'm also optimistic, and in the spirit of optimism, once again, a very, very happy birthday to Fulbright. 75th birthday, you said, yeah? Amazing. Well, thank you so much for hosting us, and above all, thanks so much to like everyone who joined in and all of the viewers. Like, I always love hearing the questions. I always love the energy. I love the enthusiasm, and I am blown away as usual by the level of engagement. So thank you for all of us for like sharing this whole journey with us. It's been amazing.
Join us in February for the next one. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Bye.